Most brands will fail before they ever even hit 6 or 7 figures of revenue because they don't have good advertising or good products. But then you'll have brands who do have good ads, who do have a good product, and who are able to scale past 7 or even 8 figures of revenue. And yet, many of those brands end up failing too. Why is it that a brand that seems to have everything figured out ends up closing their doors? The most common reason for that is because they end up having cash flow problems. They don't plan adequately, they end up spending too much, and then they run out of cash. And so smart brands try to avoid this problem by using a cash flow forecast. A cash flow forecast attempts to give you a good idea of the future inflows and outflows of cash so you can strategize accordingly. If you can see an impending cash crunch 6 months out, you can plan for that. You can cut expenses, you can negotiate with suppliers, or you can raise money. But if that cash crunch comes out of nowhere and you weren't ready for it, it's usually very hard to maneuver around. Now, while cash flow forecasts are very important, admittedly they're kind of difficult to build. A really solid cash flow forecast can require some serious expertise. However, given how important cash flow forecasts are, in this video I'm going to show you how you can build a very basic cash flow forecast from scratch yourself. It might not be perfect, but it'll put you ahead of 90% of the brands you're competing with. All you really need to get started is a spreadsheet. So let's get into it. So we'll start here with a fresh spreadsheet and see what we can build together. To get started, we'll put some dates at the beginning. We'll keep it simple and just focus on the next 12 months. So we'll start off by just adding the months along the columns. Now at the top of our forecast, we want to start off with revenue. That's the number one thing that drives the whole machine. Now while you can manually plug in numbers in every month, generally it's ideal to build things using formulas. So as an example, I'll add an extra column here where I keep my assumptions. So I'll title this first row revenue. And let's say my assumption is that in the first month, I'm going to have 100K of revenue. And very much for simplicity, we'll just say that revenue is going to increase by 2% every month. Now that may not be very accurate. It might also not be very informative. Our goal here is to start off with the basics, and you can build upon this as you get comfortable. But I'll show you some enhancements that you can make to the revenue portion of your forecast. Right now, we're just taking one number and increasing it by 2% every month. Pretty basic. But we could add an extra line over here where we manually add an extra revenue that we're anticipating. Maybe I know I'm going to have an extra 20K of revenue because of a new product launch in May. And I might be thinking I'll do an extra 80K of revenue in November because of Black Friday. This way we will combine our formulaic revenue with our manual assumptions as well. Another approach could be where I break up my revenue between the number of orders I'm anticipating and my AOV. I can assume that my number of orders will increase by 2% every single month, but I can assume also that because of some CRO or testing that I'm doing, that my AOV will increase by 0.5% every month. And here as well, I can make manual adjustments. So for example, I might say that in Black Friday, I'm expecting my number of orders to have an extra 500K, and my AOV, because I'm going to do some discounting, is going to be about $8 less than usual. You could also break this into gross revenue and discounts. So I could again say that my revenue is going to increase by 2% every month, but I know that my discounts are going to go up quite a lot in Black Friday because I know I'm going to be doing a lot of discounting. So I'll add an extra, let's say 10K of discounts. Or if you really want to get fancy, you can look at new customer revenue versus returning customer revenue. So you can say that your new customer revenue is again going to increase by 2% every month, but your returning customer revenue will always be 30% of your new customer revenue. While new customer revenue versus returning customer revenue is probably one of the better ways you can build a cash flow model, I will say that what I'm showing you here is an extremely basic implementation of it. Your returning customer revenue should actually be based on the acquisition cohorts. Here I'm just taking 30% of that month's revenue, but realistically your returning customer revenue is a function of what you've been doing for the last 12 months. But that's a little complicated for right now. The point is that there are multiple ways that you can build your revenue assumptions, and you can combine many of these methods together. But for now, since we're just focusing on the basics, let's go back to the beginning and just start with a very simple version. All right, so going back to the basic version, we're going to assume that these are the entirety of your cash inflows. If you're running sales channels like Amazon or wholesale, there might be more going on, but we'll keep it simple for now. So we'll just summarize our cash inflows, and then we'll move on to one of the most significant cash outflows, which is your marketing spend. Now here too, there are a lot of different ways that you can tackle this, but we'll keep it simple by having one line for ad spend and one line for something else. So let's start with ad spend and say influencers. Now to be able to build a forecast, you need to make one significant assumption, which is around what ROAS you're going to have as you're spending on ads. Realistically, this is the hardest part of building the forecast. You're either going to budget a specific ad spend, assume a future ROAS, and that'll give you your revenue, or you're going to set a fixed ROAS that you expect to hit and assume that you'll be able to spend at that level while maintaining that ROAS, and that will give you your revenue. Either way, one of these numbers is going to have to be guessed at, and that is the least reliable part of your entire forecast. So in a situation like this, it's always best to be conservative. So let's assume we're going to be running at a 3x blended ROAS. So assuming that, I can now predict the amount of spend that I'm going to have on ads, and I can drag that all the way to the end. So that now tells me one of my more significant cash outflows, which is my ad spend. Now for the influencers, we're going to take a bit more of a manual route. Let's assume that for the first 6 months of the year, I'm going to be spending 5K a month, and for the second half of the year, 10K. So I can just take that 5K and copy it out to June, and then put in a 10K and copy it out to the rest of the year. Now you can make this a lot more complex, like splitting up your ad spend into various channels, working with different content creators, putting in your agency expenses, but for now we're just trying to keep it simple to establish the concepts. With our total marketing spend in the model, now we have 2 of the 4 major components done. The third component is your other major cash outflow, and that belongs to your inventory. Now inventory is tricky because you don't have a smooth amount of cash going out for inventory every month. If your sales double next month, the amount of cash that you spend on inventory doesn't necessarily double the next month. Most brands will typically have large inventory cash outflows that purchase a big volume of inventory that lasts them 3 to 6 months. What makes this tricky is that different SKUs will have different suppliers and different timings for the repurchases. So to do this really effectively, your model might get rather complicated. You might have to separately calculate the rate of sales for each SKU. But again, for illustrative purposes right now, we'll keep it simple and pretend we just have a single item. So here's a simple way that you'll be able to track your inventory. We start off with an opening balance every month, but for the first month, let's just assume we have $500,000 of inventory on hand. Next, we'll assume that our cost of inventory is about 30% of the price that we sell it for. So if we have 100K of revenue, we're gonna have 30K worth of cost of goods. So we'll put the 30% in over here and we'll put in a formula. So 100K of our revenue times 30%, and let's freeze that, will give us 30K worth of cost of goods. Now the purchases are the part that we're gonna leave manual, so we'll just designate it as such. And your ending balance is gonna be the sum of everything above. Actually, I should have made that a negative, so make that a negative, so it's reducing your inventory. So now you can see I started the month with $500,000 of inventory. I had $100,000 of revenue, which means $30,000 of cost of goods. So that reduced my inventory to 470K. So now to extend this to the end, I can make it so that my opening balance is always going to be based on my ending balance of the previous month. And I can copy that all the way to the end. I can also extend the sales formula because that's fairly straightforward. And I can also extend the ending balance formula all the way to the end. So now that we've done that, we have a view of what inventory balance we can expect as time goes on. Now, based on our model so far, it shows that our inventory balance is going to start to get pretty low, under 100K towards the end of the year. That's not particularly interesting though, so I'm going to reduce my opening balance so that I can actually show you what to do. All right, that's a bit more interesting. So let's say I had $150,000 of opening balance. That means that I only have about 3 to 4 months worth of inventory. So in May, I'm going to go negative. Now, obviously you can't have negative inventory. That means I need to make sure that I have a purchase occur in March or April. So for now, let's just say I'm going to purchase $80,000 of inventory in March. The correct amount and timing is a function of your supply chain, your relationship with your manufacturers, etc. But this sort of a model will allow you to play around there. So now that'll get me all the way till July, but I get pretty low during July, so I'm going to put in another inventory order of say 50,000 in June. That gets me another 2 months, but I'm not going to have enough inventory to get through Q4. So let's say I'm going to order $120,000 of inventory. I want to have some extra backup just in case Black Friday really pops off. So I purchased 120K, but that doesn't get me towards the end of the year, so that might not be enough. So now I think to myself, all right, let's make it 180K. Cool, so now that's looking a little bit safer. So while this is a very basic version of things, this does give you an idea of showing off how your inventory balances go up and down and how the cash flow requirements change around that. So now we can move on to the fourth component, which is a bit simpler. It's all your administrative expenses. There are a ton of different items that we could build in here, but we'll keep it simple for now. So we'll put in a line for payroll, a line for rent, a line for your 3PL, and a line for software. Now the method you use to forecast each of these can vary. For example, rent, usually you'll keep it fairly straightforward and just straight line it all the way. It doesn't really change too much. Payroll can be fairly stable too. Let's say we're gonna put a 20K as a starting amount, and then we're gonna say we're basing it on that month for the rest of the year. However, say I know that in May I'm planning on hiring someone new, so I'm going to add an extra $8,000 to my payroll there. That'll carry over to the end of the year. As you get more sophisticated, you'll probably have an entirely separate tab dedicated to just all the different people, how much you're paying them, any sorts of bonuses, when they start, etc. And that tab will feed into this part of the model. Your 3PL, we might say, is a function of your revenue. So we'll say that 7%, take your total revenue and multiply that by that amount to give us our cost for the rest of the year. And maybe for software, you do something like a blend and you say it's going to be about 3% of revenue plus 5K. So I'll make this a 3%, take our formula for revenue, multiply by that, and add $5,000. And then that we can carry over to the end. So now we can sum that up, and all of these items gives us our total administrative cash outflows. So now we can sum up our total cash outflows. So we'll take our total marketing spend, we'll take our total admin, and we'll also take just the purchases component of the inventory schedule over there, because it's the purchases that indicate the cash outflow to bring in new inventory. So we can sum that up and then drag that towards the end of the year. And so now we've got the outflow portion of our cash flow. So we're close to the end now. We can add a line over here for our net cash change. So our change in net cash is simply our cash inflows minus our cash outflows. We can drag that towards the end. And now this gives us a good picture of the months in where we're cash flow positive, as well as the months that we're cash flow negative. Generally speaking, the months that you'll be the most cash flow negative are the ones where you have to make big inventory inventory purchases. But that's why the inventory portion of the model is so important, because that's the thing that throws your cash flow off the most. And to wrap things up, we can add a little reconciliation to our actual cash balance. So similar to our inventory, we'll have an opening cash amount and a closing cash amount. So let's say we have $200,000 of cash that we're starting off with. Our net cash just comes from the formula above, and our closing cash is just the sum of that. Similar to the inventory schedule, our opening cash is just the closing from the prior period, our closing cash is just a formula, and the net cash as well. So now we can take that and drag it all the way out to the end. So now this gives us visibility in what our cash balance will look like as the year progresses. We can see that while we don't ever go negative, our cash balance gets precariously low in August, September, and October. That could be a good indication that we should get a line of credit, because in case we misestimate things, we might end up with a cash crunch there. The other nice thing about a model that's built this way is that you can then start playing around with the assumptions. So what happens if I actually grow at 5% instead of 2%? All of a sudden my cash situation gets a lot better. What if my ad spend's not at a 3x ROAS but at 2.5? All of a sudden over there my cash situation gets a lot more dire. What if I decide not to hire that person in May? Does that make things better? Well, it makes it a little bit better, but maybe not as much as I'd like. And while this is a very simple version of a cash flow model, it is technically a functional model. And building something like this will already put you at a huge advantage. For brands that are a bit more advanced, the kinds of cash flows they can build can be massive and super complex. You can have spreadsheets that are 10 or 20 tabs deep that only a spreadsheet expert can understand. And for more sophisticated brands, that investment can be very worth it. But even if you're not at that level yet, any brand can benefit from having something basic. At a minimum, it'll put you in a position to be more confident when you have to make decisions. But if you found what we covered in this video a little bit daunting and you want some help, you can always work with someone from our team. We're an accounting firm that specializes in working with e-commerce brands and helping them scale. In the meantime, if you're interested in doing a little bit more research of your own, you might enjoy this video on financial forecasting. But other than that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.